So, I tried to read Evola's The Doctrine of Awakening for this video. I really did. I made it probably about a quarter of the way through. This book makes me feel like I'm listening not to a based schizo, but to my socially challenged friend in middle school walk me through his Pokemon card collection over the course of 2 hours. Julius Evola was an Italian self-proclaimed super-fascist. Born to former Sicilian aristocrats in Rome. He would claim that this made him a baron, but he was not legally recognized as such at any point, which is very funny and referenced in the meme on screen. This is one sense in which Julius Evola was a pathetic larper. He tried to go to college for engineering, but he dropped out because he said it was bourgeois. It also seems like he was kind of a pre-Wehrmacht Wehraboo. He was very into Nietzsche and apparently Max Stirner at a very early age and really admired the German spirit. Nonetheless, he still fought for Italy against Germany in World War I, making his Germanophilia another form of LARP. He also changed his name from Giulio to Julius out of admiration for ancient Rome. So this guy literally changed his name in order to take the LARP to the next level. Well, after the First World War, he became a painter in the Dadaist movement, which he eventually left behind because he felt like the avant-garde art scene was becoming too commercialized. Well, in his early 20s, he became suicidal and started using hallucinogens and studying magic, as well as Buddhism, which is apparently what saved him from killing himself. He would go on to write several books of, quote-unquote, esoteric thought, then watch the representatives of his ideology lose the Second World War, become vassals of the United States and Soviet Union, and then he eventually would die single and childless in 1974. Some of the things I mentioned derisively here are not bad in and of themselves. I definitely don't think people deserve to be made fun of for being depressed or suicidal or having other mental health issues. I also don't think disinterest or difficulty in the romantic world or in building a family are moral failures at all. I certainly don't think there's anything wrong with not being a real aristocrat, quite the contrary. What makes these things so hilarious in Evola's case is the way they're juxtaposed with his juvenile philosophy. Now, I haven't had the opportunity to closely study Nietzsche, so I won't try to summarize his thought here. But everything I've read from Evola so far reads the way the most annoying self-proclaimed Nietzscheans online present Nietzsche. He rejects the idea of an objective or external morality. He believes that some men are made to lead and act according to their will, and others are made to serve. He thinks that traditional moral values like compassion or mercy are weaknesses that were engineered to limit the potential glory of the great men. He believes these traits that make a great man are hereditary, and that rigid social stratification is the optimal social structure to allow the great men to actualize their will. That's why it's important to him that he is recognized as a real baron, even though he wasn't. You probably sometimes see rightoids online refer to themselves or to this or that concept or action as being aristocratic. That's in large part Evola's influence on far-right thinking. You can see why someone like this might become an Indophile for all the wrong reasons. Now, I don't have an issue with India. My religion comes from India. I grew up with a lot of Indian friends who are all great. I'd love to go someday. It seems like a fascinating country. But you might have encountered this strain of far-right Indophiles online that fall in love with their image of Indian culture, which is based pretty much entirely on the caste system. Now, in real life, Buddhism rejects the caste system. It rejects the caste system in large part because it rejects the divinity of the Vedas from which the caste system derives. The historical Buddha Shakyamuni was himself born into the Kshatriya class, which are fairly privileged and sometimes said to have originally been warriors. You guys probably know that the top dogs are the Brahmins, who used to be priests. Then you have the Kshatriyas in kind of second place. There are a bunch of lower castes, all the way down to Dalits, or untouchables. Well, Evola argued on extremely flimsy scriptural evidence that Shakyamuni wasn't actually against the caste system as such. He just thought that the Kshatriyas should be on top instead of the Brahmins because of their based Aryan warrior ethos. One time I saw this Italian Evolaoid on Buddhist Twitter unironically call himself an honorary Kshatriya. That was because he was following in Daddy's footsteps here. This is maybe the funniest example of Evola and his disciples being larpers. Anyway, the evidence that Evola provides for this position is a place in the Pali Canon where Shakyamuni basically says, if following someone makes you a better person, then do what they say, and if it doesn't, don't. I also find it a little ironic that Evola and his followers are described as traditionalists. One of the biggest aspects of tradition, as far as I can tell, is family. Usually in the context of, modern day revisionist traditionalism, the nuclear family. But Evola died, like I said, single and childless. And most of his modern day fans hate women so much that they hardly speak to them, let alone are starting families. Funnily enough, even though Evola is described as an esoteric thinker, his view of Buddhism is at least as presented in the Doctrine of Awakening, the book I've tried to read, isn't esoteric at all. I'm a little familiar with the Buddhist rite in Asia, and in researching for this video, I expected Evola to read more like some of the Japanese Buddhist writers, for example, who justified the Japanese Empire's actions, or some of the Buddhist nationalists in modern-day Southeast Asia. But actually, it reads much closer to the secular Buddhist slop I described 2 episodes ago in this series. And this guy's philosophy is described as traditionalist, like I said, but he actually hates Buddhist tradition. Explicitly in the text of the book, Evola dismisses Mahayana in its entirety. That's the majority of Buddhists globally. He does this because he thinks that the idea of compassion for compassion's sake is a Mahayana innovation. You can kind of see why he would think that. It's true that Mahayana places an incredibly strong emphasis on compassion. I would say more than any other religious teaching I've encountered. Because in Mahayana, compassion is a continued aspect of enlightenment itself, where you continue helping other beings literally for eternity. It's not just part of the process toward salvation, it is the final goal. In Theravada, enlightenment is usually more of a going totally beyond, not to come back. That's why Evola praises, his version of Buddhism, by which he means his misinterpretation of Theravada, ethics as not being about actually caring about other people, but just making transcendence easier for yourself. Now, there's one problem with this, even from a Theravada perspective. If Buddhist enlightenment, even in a Theravada context, is all about just looking out for number one, then why did the Buddha stick around to teach after his first nirvana? Why did every arhat in the Theravada tradition after that do that? Like, hey dumbass, you wouldn't even know what Buddhism is if there was no Buddhist ethics of altruistic compassion beyond just a means to enlightenment. He also rejects reincarnation/rebirth, which he thinks is a non-Aryan idea that springs from veneration of the earth rather than the self. So he rejects arguably the most fundamental element of Buddhist cosmology that ties the whole system together. And you shouldn't be surprised to hear he hits the Buddhism is a philosophy, not a religion button multiple times. I think that calling Evola a Buddhist fascist is unfair, because he isn't a Buddhist. You can find Buddhist fascism in places like Myanmar, Thailand, Japan, but what Julius Evola is a secular Buddhist, mindfulness slop guy who happens to also be a Nazi. Julius Evola lived a life defined really by one concept, which is LARP. He LARPed as a baron, he LARPed as a Roman, he LARPed as a German, he LARPed as a traditionalist, he LARPed as a kshatriya, and he LARPed as a Buddhist. He wasn't actually any of these things. And I don't think there's anything wrong, really, with LARP in and of itself. To the extent that LARP just means, dreaming big and making good agitprop, it can be a good thing, I suppose. I mean, hell, I run a Red Shambhala account, for God's sake. But there's nothing sadder than when LARP defines you and your legacy. Red Shambhala might be LARP, but Buddhism and communism are both potent, matrices of ideas that have been, are now, and will continue to be put into practice in ways that actually improves people's minds, and thinking about how to synthesize them is meaningful. Julius Evola, on the other hand, was LARP all the way down to the bottom of his quote-unquote aristocratic, traditionalist, kshatriya, and Buddhist ideology that wasn't any of these. And this is inevitable, really, for any ideology based on identitarianism. His puerile philosophy, if it can even be called that, is today carried on almost entirely by teenagers and young adults trying to cope with social, romantic, or career failure by fantasizing about being based in red-pilled Ubermenschen. I've placed Evola far on the exoteric end, partly as a tongue-in-cheek dig at one of the more prominent, quote, esoteric fascists, but there is a sense in which I'm being sincere. Evola may have used ideas borrowed from Western esotericism and some of his other works, but nothing about Evola is esoterically Buddhist. Buddhist esotericism is based, like a lot of esotericism, on the transmission of doctrines and anointment within a tradition. Evola wasn't initiated into any form of esoteric Buddhism. As far as I know, he never so much as formally took refuge in the Triple Gem. He wasn't even a Buddhist, much less an esoteric Buddhist. Like I said, Evola's Buddhism is far closer to a mindfulness influencer than to Buddhist fascism. I have him a little toward the Suvatist side as well. This is kind of a stretch because, like I said, he wasn't really a Buddhist and didn't have a Buddhist soteriology, but he was pretty sympathetic to Zen Buddhism because of its association with the samurai class, which he saw as analogous to the kshatriyas. I also think that Evola's absence of any sense of objective morality kind of excludes the possibility of gradual cultivation. It seems like you would just realize that you're an aristocrat and do whatever you want from that point forward and just glorify yourself, which does seem like a pretty sudden transition to me. Anyway, thanks for listening. Having finished dunking on Evola, the next video will be about one of my absolute favorite schools of Buddhist thought that has had an immense impact on my worldview, and which I'll be praising quite a bit. That's the Jodo Shinshu sect. See you then.